Theresa May gives the green light to Heathrow's third runway but lands her government in a political storm. The Prime Minister's decision to go ahead with the controversial plan has led to the first resignation tonight and is opening rifts at the top of her party.
Heathrow in the long term is not in the right place, and I'm afraid a third runway is undeliverable.
So will it be worth the political fallout, and will it boost business and please passengers? Also on News at 10 tonight. The demolition of the jungle. The first shacks are torn down in Calais' notorious migrant camp.
I've waited 30 plus years for this verdict, and I finally get it, and he just seems to just walk out the country.
Robbing his victims of justice, the paedophile imam who fled the country. Also tonight.
It's Carlos Alberto. Oh, what a great goal that was!
Forever remembered for possibly the greatest team goal ever, the life and death of Brazil's World Cup winning captain, Carlos Alberto. And why the Edstone continues to be a millstone for the Labour Party.
This is ITV News at 10 with Raghi Omar.
Good evening. So contentious has it been that a number of previous Prime Ministers have shied away from taking a decision on Heathrow's third runway. Today, Theresa May took the plunge to give it the green light and quickly found out why some of her predecessors had avoided it, because it's already led to an almighty political dispute, which is reflected not just in her party, but in her cabinet too. The government says expanding Heathrow is a vital national interest that will create tens of thousands of jobs. But several senior ministers don't agree. The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson called the plan undeliverable, and senior Conservative MP Zac Goldsmith, whose constituency is under the flight path, carried out his threat to resign and force a by-election. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Sun setting on Britain's biggest, busiest airport, about to get so much busier thanks to government approval for a new runway, which would be economic lift-off for Britain, according to the Prime Minister, but turbulence for her because this well-known Tory MP quit to challenge the airport expansion and her.
Today, as you know, I have to honour my promise. And so I've resigned as your Member of Parliament, and I'll be standing in the by-election as an independent candidate. But this election must be a referendum on Heathrow expansion. It is our chance to send a message to government and to Heathrow via the ballot box. And so I'm asking you to give me the mandate I need to continue fighting this fight.
A Transport Secretary who knows that this contentious issue has been made all the hotter by the imperative of improving our trade and transport links after that vote to quit the European Union.
Would you have gone for the third runway if we weren't leaving the European Union?
I think the Brexit referendum result makes it a bigger story for Britain. This is a really strong way of us saying to the world, Britain is open for business. The benefits that we will derive from the decision to leave, from free trade agreements around the world, will certainly be helped by having better connectivity around the world.
What do you say to those whose homes may be blighted by the increased noise and pollution, or those whose houses are going to be seized?
I have every sympathy. This is a really difficult challenge, it's a difficult time, but there is a good compensation package to enable people to move cost-free to a different place and have a premium on their price for doing so.
Right now, Heathrow has two runways. The proposed new one, which will cost a whopping £17.6 billion, will be just over 2 miles long and will sit to the north of them. There'll be a public consultation in the new year and a vote from MPs probably towards the end of 2017. The tricky and important planning should be completed by 2020, and construction of the runway and associated infrastructure should take a further 5 years. So in theory, it could all be built, finished by 2025. But there will be legal challenges from local councils, campaigners and rival airports. London. Now, the capital will get much of the economic benefits of a bigger Heathrow, but
just over 5 months ago, I was elected as mayor on a platform against a new runway at Heathrow Airport. And by the way, so was the Conservative candidates like Goldsmith, the Greens, UKIP and the Lib Dems for very good reasons. concerns around air quality and air pollution, concerns around noise pollution. I think the government's made a big mistake.
A foreign secretary who used to be mayor.
Are you still going to oppose Heathrow, Boris?
And on this, he's as one with his successor.
I think that Heathrow in the long term is not in the right place, and I'm afraid a third runway is undeliverable.
Now here's a funny thing. It wasn't that long ago that Theresa May no less pledged to fight to stop the third runway in the interest of her South of England constituents in Maidenhead. Today the Prime Minister said that in changing her mind and in promising liftoff for 260,000 new Heathrow flights every year, it's the nation she's serving. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Before the new runway gets off the ground, there will be legal challenges from people living nearby or who face losing their homes or at least their peace and quiet. As this live map of the plane movements around the airport shows, even at this time of night, there are still some coming into land. But for big business, more flights bringing overseas markets that bit closer.
Through the day and into the dark, this airport squeezes its resources to full capacity. And a new runway here will have impacts, good and bad, far beyond Heathrow. For airlines, more passengers and more destinations. Currently 480,000 flights come and go from Heathrow each year. That will increase to 740,000 with a third runway. This is the main hub of BA. It welcomed today's difficult decision, but warns against the airport passing on the costs of its gigantic investment through higher fees.
It's in nobody's interest to see these charges go up. The only people who will benefit if Heathrow charges increase are the shareholders at Heathrow.
What about these charges coming down? Do you think fares will decrease because of today's decision?
No, I don't think so. Heathrow is already a very competitive airport.
But Virgin's boss believes fares will be affected.
What passengers will see once it's actually built is, I think, much reduced fares and much more competition. And I think that's in the interest of the travelling public.
For some businesses, a big boost. It's claimed the third runway could mean an extra £211 billion over the coming decades and create 77,000 new jobs. In Wolverhampton, this business imports seafood from Asia.
It opens up the opportunity in different parts of the world, but it also gives us more capacity through our own factory.
Also on the front line are local residents. To make way for a third runway, at least 783 homes in the area will need to be demolished. Up to 920,000 residents will be impacted by the noise. Much of this village will end up under the runway tarmac. Harmondsworth residents have already spent years living with government indecision. Now this woman faces losing her home.
You're talking about history, you're talking about people in their 80s and 90s. Many of them, their families lived in this community, and their homes and their memories are going to be destroyed.
They are promising generous compensation.
I'm not interested in compensation. I find it absolutely insulting that people think that they can come in, bulldoze our home, bulldoze our villages, and that we're just happy to take money and run.
Those in favour of the new runway point out that today's government approval is still a long way from government action. Chris Choi, News at 10 at Heathrow Airport.
Well, our political editor Robert Peston joins me in the studio now. Robert, the hurdles to this plan never getting off the ground are coming up thick and fast, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, we've obviously got an important political milestone. A British government in 2003 first mooted that we needed a third runway, but Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, most would say they didn't have the bottle for it. David Cameron actually opposed it. Theresa May is the first Prime Minister to say she wants it, but there will be a planning inquiry, an MP's vote towards the end of next year. There'll be a public consultation. There will be legal challenges. Boris Johnson says it's not going to get off the ground. Who knows? I certainly think the idea that it's going to open in 2025 is almost certainly very optimistic.
So he might not be wrong there, but also quite extraordinary, the politics surrounding this whole decision and its fallout.
Yes, I mean, We look at our parliamentary system and we think it's based on discipline within the political parties. But here, on the most important decision that our new Prime Minister has made to date, she's allowing two of her most senior ministers, Boris Johnson and Justine Greening, the Education Secretary, to publicly oppose the decision to expand Heathrow. We've just seen in my piece, Zach Goldsmith is resigning and standing as an independent. The Tories aren't going to challenge him, despite the fact that he's made this really public attack on Theresa May. These are extraordinary times. We saw exactly the same thing prior to the European referendum, a breakdown of that kind of discipline. I'm not sure this, frankly, builds up confidence in the system.
Very interesting. Robert, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Later in the programme, could cleaner, quieter aero engines answer some of Heathrow's objections? Our science correspondent Alok Jha has been taking a look at engines great and small and the improvements that could change the way we fly before Heathrow's third runway is ever built. But first, in the end, it wasn't bulldozers that began the destruction of the camp for migrants and refugees known as the Jungle. Workers with hard hats and hammers moved in on the site near Calais. Plenty of people for whom it has been home have refused the offer of buses out and a transfer to a different part of France. Now, attention is switching to where they will go next.
It was unceremonial, but hugely symbolic. These pictures of workmen tearing down the notorious jungle camp will play well with much of France. The source of protest and problems for years, it should be gone by the end of this week. But they're demolishing the dreams of the migrants and refugees who have used this place as a base in their bid to get to Britain. There was disappointment here today, rather than real anger, but it's unlikely everyone will go quietly.
Problem? Maybe fight. Really? Because police cannot come and take live people like that, man.
Meanwhile, the redistribution process continues. More than half of the camp's residents are now thought to have been taken to centres across France. But many others have simply slipped away, hoping to take their chances elsewhere. Of course, some of those living in the jungle don't want to leave this part of France. They don't want to stop trying to get across the Channel. And this morning, police were called to this forest just outside Calais after reports that a group of migrants had moved here and set up camp. And there are other formal settlements along this coast full of people desperate to get to England. This camp in Dunkirk is home to 1,000 mostly Kurdish migrants. Hashem told me his wife and daughter made the crossing in the back of a lorry last month. They're now in Liverpool, and he says he won't give up until he's with them. What would you do if they closed this place, like they closed the jungle?
I have to try it in the other place.
Keep moving?
Yeah, keep moving.
And keep trying to get across to England?
Crossing the border, that's it.
The authorities here are happy. The demolition of the jungle has gone well so far. A political success, certainly, but a practical solution is still a long way off. Martin Geisler, News at 10, Calais.
Well, as the migrant camp was being dismantled in Calais, France's ambassador to London spoke to me in her only interview on British television. I asked her whether relocating the migrants to other locations in France wasn't just taking the problem somewhere else rather than tackling it.
Well, we know we prepared that very carefully, and in fact they will be relocated, not in camps, but in some centres, and we will convince them to accept asylum in France. You know, the problem is, well, those people come from Eritrea, come from Sudan, sometimes from Afghanistan. They don't speak French, they don't have family members in France. So that's the reason why they wanted to go to the UK. Since it is clear that they can't go through, that Calais is now a blind alley, so we hope that they will accept asylum in France.
But there are some who are determined to come to the UK. They'll come to Calais again or to Dunkirk, wherever there is a means of getting across the water to the UK.
Well, I hope they won't. Anyway, we will keep policemen there in Calais, so we will use the necessary means for that. Because we think it's a humanitarian question, as you mentioned before. The conditions in the camps were squalid, and it's so it's better for them to be in more comfortable centres and to be helped with their administrative procedures.
Are you worried about a hard core of people who remain in those camps, who don't want to leave voluntarily, who are determined to come to the UK, who are going to not leave? What's going to be your government's policy in the face of such protests?
Well, the government policy is to clear the camps and not to keep the camps in Calais. That's the position, to dismantle it forever.
Sylvie Berman, the French ambassador, talking to me a little earlier today. Well, the UN has released some new figures on the migrant crisis today, saying fewer people have tried to get to Europe from Africa this year, but crossings have become more dangerous. The numbers of people attempting to cross fell from over 1 million in 2015 to just under 1/3 of a million. But despite far fewer crossings, more than 3,700 lives have already been lost this year, almost exactly the same number for the whole of last year. On average, 1 in every 88 journeys now ends in death. UNHCR says there's lots of reasons for this. The North Africa to Italy route, taken by more than half, have taken this year's is notoriously perilous. People smugglers are today often using lower quality vessels, and several incidents seem to be connected with travel during bad weather, and smugglers are switching tactics to avoid detection. For 30 years, 2 women waited for justice for the sexual abuse they suffered as children from the imam at their local mosque in the West Midlands. It seemed they had finally got it when, after all this time, he was finally found guilty 2 weeks ago, or so they thought. But the imam was given bail and he escaped to Bangladesh. Today, one of the women, who is still scarred by what happened to her, told ITV News of her anger when she found out that he had absconded.
I had fear all the time. Every time I went to the mosque, there was just fear inside me. I was just scared all the time. I didn't want to be alone with him, didn't want to go to the mosque.
Nabila, not her real name, was only 7 when the abuse began at her local mosque. She was sexually assaulted nearly every day for 3 years.
He would put his arm around my waist. He would then stroke my hair and stroke my back, and again I'd feel uncomfortable. If I ever moved away or pushed his arm away, he would get tighter with his grip, so I just would stay there.
Her attacker was a respected local religious leader, an imam trusted to teach children the Muslim holy book. But Hafiz Rahman was a serial sex abuser, and 2 weeks ago he was convicted of abusing Nabila and another young girl in the 1980s. But just days before he was due to be sentenced, he fled to Bangladesh. Nabila, who'd waited 3 decades to see him brought to book, told me she feels the justice system has failed her.
I've waited 30 plus years for this verdict, and I finally get it, and he just seems to just walk out the country, no questions asked. And I'm left just wondering why, who's to blame, what's going to happen, but nothing.
Bangladesh doesn't have an extradition treaty with Britain, but the authorities say they are doing everything to track Rahman down. West Midlands police say the court hadn't asked he be arrested or remanded after conviction, leaving him on bail. But Nabila feels after being robbed of her childhood, she's now being robbed of justice. And 3 decades on, she's still living with the scars.
Purely because of him. I've disfigured my face and my body over the years, just so that he didn't think I was pretty or nice. He's stolen a lot from me. They say that he's stolen my innocence. I was thinking about things and doing things as a child that I shouldn't have been doing, and I was exposed to things that I should never have seen.
Sejal Karia reporting there. Now, for a check on the financial markets, the FTSE 100 closed back above 7,000, a rise of almost 0.5%. The pound is currently worth just below $1.22, down 0.5%, but it was quite a bit lower before the Governor of the Bank of England started talking to a House of Lords committee. Our economics editor, Narina Hertz, is here to talk about that. Narina, the markets were quite happy with Mr. Carney's performance?
Yeah, they were reassured by him. What we saw was that the pound actually went up as he spoke, undoubtedly calmed by his signalling strongly that interest rates will not be cut next week. But it's important to note that Mr. Carney reiterated that if the economy slows down over the coming year, there's little that the Bank of England can do and that it will be for the government to act. He's being realistic. His gunpowder's dry. The big question is, will the government take significant measures? Now, we're going to know soon enough. The autumn statement's only a few weeks away. But my sources suggest that it's highly unlikely that we'll be seeing a spend budget.
And a hint about his future?
Well, normally the governorship of the Bank of England is an 8-year term. So that would mean that he'd be in the job till 2021. But when Mr. Carney took the job, he only committed to staying till 2018. Now, he has said that he'll let us know by the end of the year whether or not he'll extend. This is a deadline he himself has set. Today, he didn't give much away, but he did make clear that his decision will not be based either on political events or political attacks.
It's an entirely personal decision. It is entirely personal. No one should read anything into that decision in terms of government policy, actual, imagined, potential, past, etc. It is a privilege. It is an absolute privilege for me to have this role.
I'm sure we'll be hearing more from the governor on this front over the coming months.
OK, Narina, thank you very much indeed. At the time, and to many football fans since, the Brazilian World Cup winning team of 1970 was considered the greatest that had ever played the game. But the man who captained that famous team, Carlos Alberto, has unexpectedly died at the age of 72. Leading a World Cup team is perhaps enough of an achievement in any sporting life, but Carlos Alberto will also be remembered for his part in one of football's greatest, if not the greatest, team goals.
There are only a few sporting where were you moments scattered through the decades. In the 1970 World Cup final, Carlos Alberto helped create one of those. A near-perfect goal involving almost the entire Brazilian team, a team still judged by many as the best ever to play the game. Alberto was their captain.
Oh, it's not a bad ball for Pele on the right side. It's Carlos Alberto. And what a great goal that was! Carlos Alberto!
Lifting the Jules Rimet trophy was the highlight of his playing career. The goal itself he's been asked about almost every day since.
Before Pelé stopped the ball, Pelé saw that I come, and then he stopped the ball and wait for the right time to give the ball to me.
As a manager in Brazil for 20 years, he added to his many accolades before trying his luck abroad with coaching jobs in Nigeria, Oman and finally Azerbaijan. Since then, he's been a regular pundit on Brazilian TV. Here, his last appearance just 2 nights ago. Pelé tweeted tonight, "I am deeply saddened by the death of my friend and brother. Dear God, please take care of our capital." Across the sporting world, Carlos Alberto will always be remembered for applying the finishing touch to a minute's worth of footballing artistry. Collective brilliance on the biggest stage football has to offer. Most fans, of course, have never watched him play, but the reality is the legacy Carlos Alberto's Brazilian team left the game can be seen every Saturday at every ground.
Brazil's Carlos Alberto, whose death was announced earlier today. As we saw earlier in the programme, there are big environmental objections to the Heathrow third runway option. The arguments will run and run, but at the moment, the aviation industry accounts for 6% of the UK's total CO2 emissions. The vast majority of those aviation emissions, 95% in fact, are from international flights. Reducing that growth can be achieved by decreasing the carbon intensity of flights. In other words, emissions per passenger. Thanks to the development of more fuel-efficient planes and engine designs, by 2050, that carbon intensity is predicted to fall by more than a third. The aviation industry hopes fuel efficiency will meet our climate targets and allow the demand for air travel to carry on growing.
Rolls-Royce is one of the world's leading manufacturers of jet engines, with more than 13,000 flying commercially today. It's also at the forefront of efforts to make flying more environmentally friendly. Here in Derby, they finish making one gas turbine engine almost every day.
This is the most efficient jet engine flying today. It uses less fuel and it moves more air slowly, which makes it quieter. And to achieve all of that, it had to get bigger.
A bigger fan means more air flows through the engine and it can flow more slowly.
So this is the latest engine in the family. This is the Trent XWB.
For these engineers, it's just one idea to make future airplanes use less fuel and to make them quieter.
We haven't run out of ideas. The basic gas turbine, there's a long way to go. There's probably 20 or 30% improvement still to have.
What are the technologies that you're going to use to enable the next generation of these engines?
We want to make the fans bigger, so move even more air slower, but also, in the heart of the engine, driving even higher pressure ratios and even hotter temperatures. Beyond that, we're looking at the incorporation of more electric technologies.
And here's a glimpse into that electric future. Inside these wings, some of the fuel tanks have been replaced by batteries. It uses a third less fuel than a standard aircraft engine.
What we have here is a petrol engine at the front, as a standard piston engine, and then on the back of that is the electric motor, the gold-coloured piece.
So this airplane still uses fossil fuels. At what point do you think we'll have a plane that just uses electric?
So I think electrics will be several decades away from now. In the interim time, I think we'll see an increase in the use of hybrid power plants, starting with the smaller aircraft, but moving up through using biofuels, hybrid diesel-type fuels to smaller scale commuter aircraft.
The weak link is battery technology. It'll take around 30 or 40 years for batteries to be as powerful per kilogram as jet fuel. And beyond that, in the latter half of this century, planes could look very different. This plane was designed at Cambridge University and is now being developed by Boeing and NASA. The shape, a blended wing body, makes it fuel efficient, and the position of the engines shields people underneath from the noise. Heathrow's third runway won't begin operating for at least a decade, but engineers have to innovate now to have any chance of mitigating the increased environmental impact of the planes of the future. Alok Jha, News at 10.
Finally, the block of stone emblazoned with Ed Miliband's election promises last year became, pardon the pun, something of a millstone around the Labour Party's neck. Now it's ended up costing the party dear in another way. Labour has been fined £20,000 for not declaring all its election spending, including the bill for the so-called Ed Stone.
It's one of those things, ideas like this, the trouble comes when nobody tells you it's a bad idea until you've done it.
Serious grown adults sat in meetings and approved this thing. You can see the thinking behind it, and the thinking behind it was incredibly stupid. It was, people don't believe us, so we're going to carve them on stone and then people will believe us.
And as bad ideas go, it was an expensive one. Standing over 8 feet tall and with all those promises carved into it, the Ed Stone cost £7,614 to make. That sum among more than £120,000 of payments missing from Labour's 2015 election expenses return. And that has now cost the party a record £20,000 fine from the Electoral Commission, almost 3 times the price of the stone itself. This museum curator wanted the Ed Stone to stand alongside his other prized political artefacts like Michael Foot's donkey jacket and Harold Wilson's pipe. He was told no.
This was a moment when the Labour Party wanted to appear solid, grounded, that they were serious, and clearly they hadn't quite projected that to the public widely, and the stone was a symbol of perhaps that failure to project that message.
I want the British people to be in no doubt.
Ed Miliband didn't win, the Stones never been seen since, and for fans of things that seemed like good ideas at the time, a shame indeed. Damon Green, News at 10.
Coming up tomorrow, we'll be hearing from billionaire Bill Gates about his foundation's latest plans to eradicate malaria, and the literary world will be digesting news that the author Paul Beatty has tonight become the first American to win the Man Booker Prize. Tom will be here tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.